Chapter 26. Cyberdyne, the Present. At the sound of the approaching elevator, Sarah stopped what she was doing and ducked behind the receptionist's island. Who the hell is that? She wondered. Surely Dieter would know better than to use the elevator. She pulled her Glock from its holster and rested her gun hand on the desk, eyes on the elevator door. The door was opened, and Jordan braced his leg against one side to keep them there as he peeked out into the corridor. So, should I take the elevator back up or use the stairs? He wondered. Maybe he ought to check the indicators, see if Serena was following him. He edged out of the elevator slightly. Sarah fired, aiming for the thigh of the leg inching its way into view. Jordan went down screaming. He thrashed on the floor, cursing and trying vainly to keep quiet. It hurt so damn much. Jesus, 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 he hissed, half cursing, half praying. Sarah recognized him from Sacramento, the man who had said he would take care of John. She rushed from behind the desk to stand over him, her gun aimed at his head. "Don't move!" she ordered. Jordan opened his eyes to find himself staring into a small black hole. His breath stopped. It took 5 long seconds for him to make his lungs work again, and he took his breath with a long, tearing gasp. "Where's my son?" Connor said. Her voice and face were as cold as the moon and as distant. He's okay," Jordan stammered. He couldn't stop shaking, and his leg burned. "He's on 3, setting up bombs." She appeared to think about that. After a moment, she took a deep breath and let it out in a sigh. Then she almost smiled, looking younger in an instant. "That's my boy," she said proudly. "He can talk anyone around, even me." Sarah holstered her gun and squatted down to offer help to her victim. "The bullet went clean through. Doesn't look like I nicked any veins or arteries from the way it's bleeding. Can I have your tie?" she asked. "No," Jordan snapped. "I already used it to bandage your son." "I will never again question why I have to wear that stupid strip of cloth to work," he thought. He wished now that the unofficial dress code required him to wear 2 ties. "Well, you'd better give me something to use unless you want to bleed to death," she said briskly. Jordan shrugged out of his jacket and took off his shirt, with her help. Sarah used her knife to tear it into strips. "First you shoot my brother, now you shoot me. What the hell have you got against my family, lady?" "What are you talking about?" she asked, frowning. "My brother was Miles Dyson," he said. He sucked in his breath through his teeth as a sharp pain shot through his leg. "Miles," she said thoughtfully as she sliced away his pants leg. "He was a good man." Sarah smiled, her eyes on her work. "I guess next time I'd better ask questions first and shoot later," she said. "Uh-huh," he agreed. "Ah!" "Has to be tight," she explained. "What about circulation?" he asked, glaring. Sarah stood up and looked down at him. "I guess that's your responsibility. Look, I've got things to do. Stay cool, I'll be right back." "Stay cool? Hey!" he said as she walked away. "I'm being chased. That mommy Terminator you've been worried about is after me." She looked over her shoulder at him. "Then I'd better work fast." Dyson let his head fall back against the wall and closed his eyes. "Yeah, I guess you better," he said softly. He swallowed and tried to fight down a sudden nausea. "Maybe it's time I tried to make a deal with God," he thought irreverently. "Every agent does, sooner or later. Paulson had once told him that. So you should work out your terms in advance." Jordan lightly placed his hands on either side of the wound, just above the bandage, and wished he could ignore the pain. He felt a falling sensation within, and when he opened his eyes again, he thought some time might have passed. Off to his right, the door to the stairs began to open. "Connor!" he shouted. He tried frantically to move, to back into the elevator, and couldn't seem to make his body work as a coordinated whole. "Sarah?" Sarah dropped her screwdriver and ran towards his voice. She arrived in time to see a Terminator raise its gun, aiming at Dyson. Response was automatic. She plucked the taser from her belt, ran towards the Terminator, aimed and fired, even as it began to wheel towards her. The results were dramatic. Sparks shot from the Terminator's head, and it flailed its arms and legs like a marionette gone mad. Its trigger finger convulsed again and again, firing the gun in uncontrolled bursts. Sarah threw herself to the floor and wished she could get lower. The machine kept firing until all that could be heard was the impotent clicking of an empty magazine. Then, without warning, it was over. The Terminator crashed to the ground, frozen, sprawled like a giant doll, broken and abandoned. After a moment's silence, she crawled to the edge of the desk and peered around it. The Terminator lay inert. She moved over to it and tugged at the gun. It wouldn't let go, not without tools. She rifled through its pockets for spare magazines and took those. Dyson was flat on his back, most of his body in the elevator, so she couldn't tell if he was alive or dead. Sarah moved cautiously over to him, her eyes on the Terminator. As she moved, she snapped out the used taser cartridge, its wires still attached to the Terminator's torso, and replaced it. It was more powerful than the standard model, but it would be useless unless it recharged. She quickly checked her watch. 20 minutes or so until it could be used again. She hung the unit on her belt and withdrew her pistol from its holster, just in case. It wouldn't kill a Terminator, but it might slow one down. And it made her feel better. She wished there was some way to be sure that the Terminator was down for good, but the damn things didn't have a pulse she could check. She glanced in at Dyson. He was looking back, seeming no worse for wear. "You okay?" she asked, moving her eyes back to the quiescent Terminator. "Just lucky," he said sarcastically. "Incidentally, if you see a blonde hoe with a very bad attitude who can walk through walls, kill her. That's Serena Burns, inhuman genius from the future. Sorry, I'm babbling." "Shock," said the woman he'd hated for 6 years, and smiled. He struggled to a sitting position, and Sarah was reaching down to help him when the door to the stairs was thrown open, hitting the wall like a gunshot. Sarah straightened, saw a woman with a gun, and without hesitation raised her own gun and shot. Serena's head snapped back from the force of the blow, and her vision went white, then black. She felt herself falling, and had time to comprehend one word, and to feel all the dread that accompanied it. Failure. Then she was gone. Jordan leaned forward and watched with his mouth open in horror as Serena slowly crumpled, then fell to her knees, then forward onto her face. The right side of her head was a mass of blood. The pink-grey pulp of her brain was visible, and the gold-blonde hair was matted into spikes with it. "My God," he said. He looked at Sarah, who was frowning at the fallen woman. "I thought you were going to ask first." Sarah looked down at him. "Everybody's a critic," she growled. She indicated Serena with her chin. "That the one you were talking about?" "Yeah," Jordan said. "That's her. She dead?" Sarah shrugged and put her gun away. "Time will tell." She glanced at Jordan, then went over and pried the gun from the woman's stiff fingers. Sarah touched her neck, feeling for a pulse. If she has a brain, which she visibly did, then she must be human, she thought. So if there's no pulse, she should be out of the game. There was a lot of blood, too. Terminators didn't have this much in their whole massive bodies. Sarah frowned. The idea of a human running Terminators was mind-boggling. "No time," she reminded herself. "Get going." Returning to Jordan, she offered him the gun, but first. "So you won't feel so defenseless," she said. "Thanks," he said, accepting it. He looked up at her. Sarah felt as though he wanted her to say something, but she had no idea what it was. "I have to finish some things," she said. "Hold the fort and don't shoot my kid, okay?" He raised the gun in salute. "You got it," he said. He watched her go back into the office she'd come out of. Then he looked around. His hands were shaking, so he dropped the gun to the floor beside him and clasped them hard. Jordan grimaced at the bodies on the floor and let out his breath in a little huff. They looked so human. What if they are human? He thought. What if the Connors are delusional and I've somehow become infected? Then an image of Serena making those fantastic leaps came into his mind's eye. He'd actually seen that with his own eyes. This might be the craziest thing that would ever happen to him, but he, at least, was not insane. Jordan shook his head and slowly dragged his wounded leg into the elevator. He pushed himself back until he was leaning against the wall. Next time something came through that door, he was not going to be a sitting target. He reached up. Yes, he could touch the elevator's control panel. He could shut the door at need. He let his head lean against the wall and once again allowed himself to relax. Reroute. Electronic components no human could have designed struggled to throw off their passionless equivalent of shock. They had been integrated with the biological half of their personality for a very long time. Autonomous reintegration took a long time, several complete seconds. Checksum, response, negative. Damage? Neurological, central brain stem, non-responsive. Function terminated. 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 Decision tree. Restart autonomous functions from backup. The corpse's lungs heaved. Once. Twice. The heart began to beat with an artificial steadiness. The computer analyzed how much function remained in muscle and organ. Enough for a few minutes, if it controlled fluid loss from the ruined brain. But it had never been designed to move the organism in this manner. Complex calculation would be required. Fingers quivered, clenched. A heel softly tapped the ground. An eye opened, and the pupil cycled from pin-sized to a black disc that swallowed the blue of the iris. Serena Burns was dead, but her body began to move. "Last one," John said to Dieter, who shoved the dolly he'd found in the janitor's closet under the barrel. "Okay," Von Rossbach panted. They'd been working well together, and fast, running back and forth to the lift every minute or so, it seemed. Dieter glanced up as he pulled the barrel out of the elevator. "Oh my God," he said softly. John looked up at the indicator. There were now 2 elevators on 4. "Mom!" he said, and ran for the stairs. "No!" Dieter said, catching him by the back of his shirt. "Don't just run out there. Look first." "Right," John said. He took a deep breath and gave the big man a rueful look. "Don't tell Mom, okay?" "What do you think?" Dieter said. Cautiously, they opened the door and listened. Von Rossbach nodded, and they moved carefully down the stairs. Jordan had fallen into a state of physical and emotional lethargy. His leg hurt, but he knew he couldn't do anything about it, and on some level he had accepted the pain. Should I be worried about that? He wondered. When he saw signs of movement from Serena, he thought he might be hallucinating, possibly going into shock. At first, all he saw were random twitches, movements so small they might have been imaginary. Then there was a full-body convulsion. Something post-mortem, he told himself wisely. Possibly brought on by all the fast food she's been eating. And boy, could that girl pack away junk food. He'd always wondered how she managed to stay so slim. Then her head lifted, and he had a full-body convulsion of his own. "Sarah!" he shouted. This can't be happening. I'm going into shock, he thought. "Sarah!" Serena's head came up off the floor. Her face, streaked with blood, was utterly white, the eyes lifeless. She stayed in that position, motionless, for what seemed like a long time. There was a dark hole just above her right eyebrow, and blood dripped slowly from her chin. "Sarah, it's alive! Sarah!" He could feel the blood draining from his face, and he begged God not to let him faint. Where the hell is she? He wondered frantically. "Connor!" Serena's head turned in his direction, but her eyes seemed unfocused. Jordan found he couldn't speak. His mouth went dry, and his heart beat so fast it almost hurt. Then Serena's body shifted. in an almost insect-like series of motions that first lifted her onto her hands and knees, then onto her fingertips and toes. Her head dipped and turned in sharp, abrupt movements, as though adjusting itself to this position. A human couldn't have held her head at that angle without pain. A human couldn't have held her body like that without dropping to the floor almost immediately. "Connor!" Jordan screamed. Utter horror struck as he pushed himself back against the elevator wall with his good leg, until he was almost standing. "It's alive!" The thing that had been Serena Burns shifted its head to look in his direction, and Jordan pushed the closed doors button frantically. Nothing happened. He pushed a floor button. "The elevator is dead," he thought. "Oh God, so am I." He got himself onto his feet and half hoped, half slid his way around to the door and through it. The Serena thing scuttled towards him rapidly, and he shouted in wordless terror, as he might had a spider the size of a wolf walked out of his dreams. Instinctively, he put his weight onto his wounded leg and went down to one knee. He thought of the gun, still inside the elevator, and threw himself sideways. Grabbing it, he rolled over and fired. It hit her in the shoulder, and she folded back onto her knees, her head still up, still apparently watching him. Jordan once again dragged himself to the side of the elevator, never taking his eyes off the thing, and pushed himself to his feet. He wondered how he would get past it. It blocked most of the doorway. He and the thing looked at one another. The thought of touching it made him want to vomit, and he swallowed bile. Then she scuttled backward until she reached the desk. Slowly, she maneuvered herself from a kneeling into a sitting position, her feet tucked under in a way that should have been agonizing. She pushed herself up until she was standing on her 2 feet. Then she froze. The wound in her shoulder didn't seem to bother her at all. The bizarre manner in which she climbed to her feet had brought no change to her bland expression. Somehow, although she was looking right at him, her eyes seemed blind. Jordan noticed that she wasn't breathing. In shock, he tucked into himself as though someone had poked him in the stomach. "I've got to get out of here," he thought, and he hopped forward, sliding along the wall once he was outside the elevator. He had to find Connor. He risked a glance towards the office where Sarah had disappeared, and that's when the thing made its move. He brought up the gun, but it grabbed his wrist and pulled him forward. Once again, his leg failed him, and he began to fall. The thing struck him across the face hard enough to send him sprawling, then twisted the gun from his grip as he went down. Sarah finished setting the detonator on the time fuse. She had no idea exactly what was happening out there, but she did know that there was probably very little she could do about it. The taser still had 10 minutes to charge, and this had to be finished. Cyberdyne was going up tonight, Terminators and all, even if she and Dyson had to go with it. When she was finished, she picked up the gun and stood. "Okay, minions of Skynet, here I come, ready or not." She moved cautiously out of the office, thinking, "Dieter, find my son. Keep him safe. Please, my friend. Please." She arrived just in time to see Serena knock Dyson off his feet. Taken completely by surprise, she froze for a second. Between the two of them, Dyson and the woman, this one was the least likely to be on her feet again. People with their brains blown out didn't get up again, and she'd seen the pink and grey jelly spatter. The bloodied blonde head whipped around, and the woman raised her gun and fired in one sharp movement. The bullet clipped the bone at the top of Sarah's right shoulder, and her gun went flying. Sarah dropped down behind the desk as the blonde woman fired once more, then stopped. Connor pressed down on her shoulder, her eyes tearing, and sucked air between her teeth. She was dizzy and nauseous, and black and white spots danced at the edge of her vision. "Focus!" she ordered herself. "Focus!" Sarah heard footsteps and looked around for the gun. It was under a desk about 12 feet away from her. Gritting her teeth, she forced herself to crawl. Her right arm was almost useless, but she pushed herself forward with her feet. Almost there. She reached forward, and a bullet almost took off her fingers. The I-950 continued to move forward, continued to work on readjusting its faltering visual equipment. It sensed that it had come very close that time, but the biological elements were failing, and the implants could only compensate to a certain extent. When failure came, it would be an exponential process. Sarah pushed herself backward on the smooth floor, back towards the receptionist's desk. The Terminator, and it had to be a Terminator, had a gun in its hand, she was sure. She wished the damn taser would hurry up and recharge. Finding its target gone, the I-950 listened and heard slithering noises off towards the fallen six. It couldn't run, at least not yet, but it moved inexorably forward towards its fallen companion. The human mustn't be allowed to obtain a weapon. This unit was vulnerable to guns. Sarah stretched out her arm as far as it would go and grasped the barrel of the gun. She tugged and nothing happened. She couldn't even drag the arm closer to her. Whatever had happened to its internal circuits when she hit it with the taser had caused the machine to freeze into a single immovable piece. "God damn it!" she thought. Easing herself forward, Sarah brought her other hand into play, trying to wrestle the weapon out of the big hand as quietly as possible. She didn't waste much time on it. It took her a matter of seconds to realize it was hopeless. Sarah pressed her hands to the floor to push herself backward. The I-950 fired and wounded Connor's left forearm. The human cried out in pain. It had to be content with that. Enough wounds, even minor ones, would kill the human with cumulative damage. Soon she would be incapacitated enough that the Infiltrator could kill her with its hands. Perhaps that was best. Sarah pushed herself backward, frantically, aiming for one of the desks behind its beige partition. Maybe I can lure it into this maze and lose it long enough to get back to the stairs or the elevators. She'd like to get Dyson out of here, if she could. Assuming he was still alive, that is. She got herself onto her hands and knees and launched herself towards the clerk's den of cubicles before her. The Terminator fired and hit her, creating a searing line of fire along her ribs. Sarah caught her breath in a sob, gritting her teeth, then moved on. She dived into a cubicle, separated the wall, then pushed them back together again, hoping the Terminator wouldn't know how to follow her. The I-950 followed Connor into a cubicle, but found her gone. It heard sounds on the far side of the wall and considered shooting, but decided against it. Its supply of ammunition was limited, while the target's ability to escape seemed unlimited. The Infiltrator had no doubt of its eventual success. It merely conserved supplies in order to ensure it. Sarah moved as quietly as she could, which was difficult. Her wounds were relatively minor, but they all bled. She could feel herself growing weaker, and she felt clumsy and disorientated. I should go back towards the front of the office, she thought. She could see the gun under that desk in her mind's eye, and she needed a weapon desperately. The next turn brought her out onto a main corridor beside the wall. Left or right? She wondered. She couldn't see very much difference from here between either end of the corridor. Left, she decided, and began to stumble in that direction. She was almost there when she looked up and saw that she was heading the wrong way. There was a sound somewhere behind her, and she ducked into the nearest cubicle. Hunkering down and pressing herself against the soft wall, she listened, breathing through her mouth to quiet her breathing. Outside, the I-950 stalked by with no attempt to hide itself. Its head swung like a gun turret from side to side. Its eyes didn't seem to be working right. Maybe it was listening. The thought bumped Sarah's heartbeat up a notch, and she grimaced. If it can't hear that, it must be deaf. After the Terminator passed, she slipped out and crept to the other cubicle, ducking in there. She waited a few heartbeats, then risked looking out into the corridor. It was empty. The Terminator must have turned the corner. Sarah slipped out and ran as fast as she could towards the elevators. The I-950 stepped around the corner and fired. A good, solid hit this time in the target's leg. The woman went down and thrashed on the floor for a moment. Then she was gone. Sarah limped as fast as she could down the cross corridor towards the far wall, blinded by tears. With every step that pulsed out more of her blood, her mind swore and raged. I've got to bind this up, she thought. Her worry was the trail she was leaving rather than her probable collapse. Sarah refused to contemplate such an eventuality. When she got around the next corner, she went down on one knee and for a moment couldn't get up. Surrendering to necessity, she sat, her back to the cubicle wall, and pulled off her belt. She stuffed the taser in her pocket. Still 5 minutes left until it could be used. Unbelievable, she thought. It feels like I used it yesterday. With shaking hands, she bound her belt tightly around her leg. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The Infiltrator moved slowly down the corridor, expecting to find its target at any moment. Even the most slippery human was vulnerable to blood loss. Once again, it tried to force more speed, only to find that it slowed it more. The elevators were non-functional, it remembered, and with the wound in her leg, climbing stairs would be slow going for Connor. Skynet would prevail. Sarah struggled to her feet and found that it made her dizzy and brought a mouthful of bile. She spat it out on the floor and swallowed, the bitter fluid rasping at her throat. When she tried to take a step, she found that her leg wouldn't bear her weight. Giving in, she allowed herself to collapse to the floor, and lying flat, crawled. It was easier. Halfway along the corridor, she spied a boxed fire hose on the wall. Above it was another box. Behind its glass was a fire axe. Sarah looked at it stupidly for a moment. Then she smiled. Low tech, she thought, but serviceable. Beside the whole arrangement was a smaller box. If the glass on this was broken and the button pushed, the safety sprinklers would be activated. Do I want to be wet? She wondered. Do I want to be alive? She answered herself. Her mind seemed to be moving more slowly. The plan formed immediately. But it took her several moments to work out how to actually do it. The water first. That might help to hide sound and movement. Sarah dragged herself up and hit the glass with its tiny hammer. She almost broke down and cried when the glass only cracked. She hadn't thought she was so weak. What if I can't do it? She thought of Kyle. On your feet, soldier! She thought fiercely. She hit the glass again and it shattered. Pressing the button, she flinched when the first drops of water hit. It was cold. The infiltrator stopped dead as water exploded from the sprinklers above. There was nothing in its memory to explain this. What did it mean? Irrelevant, it decided. Something the enemy had done, though how or why it didn't know. Perhaps the intention was to obscure its vision or hearing. Looking out into a world gone grey, the infiltrator thought its enemy had succeeded better than it could know. Dieter insisted on going through the door first, which John had no problem with. He was wounded and therefore less able. John covered him, a gun in his left hand. There was a nasty, squeezing sensation in his head at the sight of the prone Terminator just outside the door. Dieter shoved it with his foot, barely shaking it. Then his gun hand snapped up at the sound of a groan. Looking around, he saw Dyson sprawled in a heap by the elevator. He moved quickly over to him, and John followed. He noticed a pool of blood beside the Terminator, and looked around. Von Rossbach knelt beside Dyson and gently turned him over. Jordan's eyes were open, but were as yet uncomprehending, and he groaned again. Dieter tapped his cheek gently, whispering, "Dyson, wake up, Dyson." John crouched beside them, his back to the wall, eyes roving. "Where's my mother?" he asked. "What's going on?" Jordan caught that and tried to answer. The words came out strangled and garbled, and he frowned. He licked his lips and tried again. "Another Terminator," he said. "My boss. Sarah shot her." His eyes rolled towards Dieter, and he shook his head slightly. "She came back to life. It got the drop on your mother. They're out there, somewhere." He gestured weakly towards the semi-dark cubicles. John and Dieter both rose to their feet, looking outward. There was the distant sound of breaking glass, and then the water came on. "This way," Dieter said, and plunged towards the sound. Sarah was sitting beside the doorway on the rolling desk chair, her back to the wall, waiting for the Terminator to pass. In her hands was the fire axe. She hefted it, holding it ready to strike. The I-950 moved slowly down the corridor. It wondered how long this rain effect would last. It was diminishing its effectiveness. It paced on, head turning, listening. Sarah watched it pass, then leapt up and brought the axe down as hard as she could. John and Dieter rounded the corner in time to see an axe flash up, then down. It was a moment before John realized that his mother had wielded it. He ran towards them. The bright head of what must have been Jordan's Terminator boss turned, and its hand flashed back. He screamed as he watched it plunge that hand deep into his mother's abdomen in a classic knife hand. Sarah's eyes turned back into her head, and she went down. The Terminator readied itself for a death blow, moving slowly but powerfully. Dieter crouched, holding his Browning high power in both hands, and fired. The blonde head bucked away, and the Terminator dropped to its knees. John fired, less accurately with his left hand, and struck it on the shoulder. Slowly it fell, landing athwart his mother. John ran towards them, and with a strength he hadn't known he possessed, grabbed the Terminator and flung it aside. He gathered Sarah up into his arms and, weeping, called to her. "Mom!" he sobbed. "Mom, don't die, okay? Please, please don't die!" Dieter looked down at him, then turned to the female Terminator that was still moving weakly. He put his pistol against its head and fired several times. John jumped and looked at him desperately. Von Rossbach knelt beside them and checked Sarah over. The wound in her side was bad. Dieter had nothing on him suitable for making bandages, and neither had John. He glanced around and saw a scarf hanging from a coat rack in the cubicle before him. He grabbed it and bound it tightly around Sarah's abdomen. Then he picked her up and carried her towards the stairs, John trotting anxiously beside him. Jordan was sitting up, somewhat revived by the cold water pouring from the ceiling. He gasped when he saw Sarah Connor's limp form in von Rossbach's arms. "Can you get up if John helps you?" Dieter asked. "I'd better," Jordan said. He struggled to his feet, and John slipped under his arm. They staggered a bit at first, then found a way to center their mutual weight. John pressed the elevator button. "It's not working," Jordan said. "I tried." Together they struggled towards the stairs and began the long journey upward. Dieter noticed a change in Sarah's breathing and felt his heart contract. Then he saw her eyelids lift, and his heart did too. "It's me, Dieter," he said softly. "I've got you. You're going to be all right." Her eyes closed slowly, and he had no idea if she'd heard him. Even he was gasping for breath by the time they came to the top of the stairs. Jordan, so breathless he was unable to speak, touched von Rossbach's arm and signaled him to wait. Frowning, Dieter complied. 3. Dyson said, holding up 3 fingers. Dieter's face lit as he comprehended the message. There had been 3 Terminators in Sacramento. 2, and their master, were destroyed. That left 1 unaccounted for. He gently lowered Sarah to the ground. She moaned and shifted a bit. "Sarah," he whispered, "there's 1 more Terminator. I've got to take it out." "Pocket," she mumbled and made a weak gesture. He glanced down and saw the butt of the taser sticking out of her jeans. "That ought to do it," he whispered, smiling down at her. He kissed her on the forehead, then lowered her head. John was there in an instant, sliding his arm under her. Their eyes met, and Dieter nodded, then rose. He was the only unmarked member of the team. This would be up to him. Dieter cracked the metal door slightly to glance out into the reception area. Without warning, a barrage of bullets erupted. Holes punched through the metal, and von Rossbach lent his strength to get his wounded comrades out of the line of fire. The firing stopped, and they heard footsteps approach the door. Dieter readied the taser. The doorknob turned, slowly, quietly. Then it stopped. The tension mounted as nothing happened. The Terminator held the knob in position. It sent out a call to Serena and to its fellows, and received no answer. It was unimaginable that humans could eliminate so many of its kind. Perhaps a fellow Terminator, badly damaged and unable to communicate, waited behind this barrier. Humans couldn't do it serious harm, it decided. It pushed open the door. Dieter didn't even have to aim. He fired and the cords flashed out. Von Rossbach grabbed the Terminator's hair and yanked it forward into the stairwell, where the inevitable pyrotechnics wouldn't be visible from outside. Then he popped out the cartridge and put the taser in his jacket pocket. He bent and lifted Sarah carefully. Even so, she made a soft sound of pain. Then he led them to the front doors. They got a good way from the building and took refuge in the deep shadows behind the concrete and metal Cyberdyne sign. He and John laid down their burdens, then turned back towards the building. "Do you think Mom finished setting up the bombs?" John asked. "Timer," came from behind him, and he knelt beside her. "I think she said timer," Jordan suggested. "It doesn't matter," Dieter said. He held out a signaler. "I have this." He pulled out the antenna. "Wait!" John said. He pointed. "The guard, under the desk." Dieter sighed, then handed the signaler to John. "I guess I'd better go and get him," he said. "Maybe we should set off an alarm or something in case somebody else is in there." It was what Sarah would want him to do. He jogged towards the building, keeping an eye out for any wandering army personnel. Luck, such as it was with him. No one appeared. He tapped in the test sequence and the door lock disengaged. Dieter moved to the desk and found the guard fully awake. He pulled his knife and cut the tape around the man's head. "Is there anybody else in the building?" Von Rossbach asked. "Miss Burns, the chief of security, and 2 other guards," the man answered. "We've got to call the MPs. This is bigger than we can handle." "These guards," Dieter said. One of them has a funny haircut, and the other is bald. Yeah, that's them, he said eagerly. They're already out, von Rossbach said. Can you walk? Yeah, I think so, the guard said. He rubbed his wrists where Dieter had cut the tape. We should set off the alarm, he suggested. I tried that. I think they've disabled it. Let's get out of here and then we can call for help. Good idea, the guard said. He held out his hand and Dieter pulled him to his feet. Go, Dieter said, giving the man a shove. He grabbed a handful of the guard's shirt and began to run, half carrying the man. Keep moving, he insisted. He ran the man to where his friends were hiding. The man stopped, goggling, and hardly reacted when Dieter's hands clamped down on his carotids. Risky, but still safer than trying to knock him out. The guard hit the dirt with a muffled thump, and Dieter shook his head ruefully. He'll have a headache, but he'll live. Is there anyone else in there? John asked. Von Rossbach shook his head. Not according to him, he said, indicating the fallen guard. At least nobody human. John licked his lips and glanced at his mother. You do it, Dieter said. John hit the ignition button and felt a shiver beneath his feet. Almost instantly, the doors and the roof of Cyberdyne systems blew out in a giant orange fireball. They ducked as fragments began to rain down. John covered his mother's head and shoulders. Then he straightened and looked at her. She was so still. Her lips were pale, and she seemed to be barely breathing. Dieter's hand came down on his shoulder, and he jumped, opening his mouth in a soft gasp. John, he said, we have to go. Dieter tightened his lips. We can't take her with us, he said quietly. John turned to him, his face streaked with tears. What? He said. We can't leave her. Do you know what they'll do to her? John shook his head. I can't let them put her back in that place. She still has nightmares about it. John, she's too badly hurt. If we take her with us, she will certainly die. If we leave her with Jordan, they may be able to save her life. I promise you, we will come back for her. John hesitated, clasping her hand tightly. Then he took a deep breath and let her go. He turned to Jordan. Take care of her, he said. Don't let them drug her like they did before. Promise me. John's eyes were desperate, but the tears were drying. Jordan nodded solemnly. I give you my word, he said. I'll watch over her as best I can. Come on, Dieter said. He looked at Sarah's face and clenched his jaw. I will be back for you, he promised her silently. Don't lose hope. Then he and John ran. They got to Ferry's quarters without being seen, often by the simple expedient of running backward in a crowd, or in Dieter's case, by issuing orders before people got a good look at them. Von Rossbach stuffed John into the false-fronted trunk in the back of the Humvee and entered the Major's house. He changed, dropping the used clothes into Ralph's hamper. Then he went into the kitchen and shook Ferry's shoulder. Dieter propped him up in his chair and lightly slapped the Major's face. Ralph, he said. Hey, Ralph! Ferry snorted, then tried to push von Rossbach off him with fumbling hands. What's up? He asked. Finally, he opened his eyes, which promptly threatened to roll back into his head. Dieter slapped him again, lightly. Something's happened, he said. Listen, something's up. Slowly, the Major came to himself, a look of confusion on his face. Then the sirens registered. Something happened? He said. Dieter offered him some aspirin and a glass of water. Ferry took them, his eyes meeting von Rossbach's. He popped the pills into his mouth and took a mouthful of water. You bastard, he said quietly and without rancor. You owe me. I do, Dieter said. Get out of here, the Major said. He went to the phone and dialed a couple of numbers. Ferry here, he said. What and where? He listened for a moment, then glared at von Rossbach. Okay, he said. I'm on my way, and I've got a friend visiting me. I'm sending him on his way. See that they don't hassle him at the gate. Dieter von Rossbach, yeah. Okay. He hung up and turned to his friend. I expect an explanation, he said. You'll get one, Dieter said. He held out his hand. No hard feelings? Hell yes, Ferry snapped. But he took Dieter's hand. Right now, we're even for Srebrenica. But I always did hate those cyber snots. Get lost, he said. They left together, Ferry heading for Cyberdyne without looking back, Dieter driving for the gate, his heart in his throat. I'll be back, he thought at Sarah. They were close to the Chamberlain's cabin when Dieter's cell phone beeped. Von Rossbach, he answered. Dyson, came the clipped answer. Dieter took a deep breath, but said nothing. He couldn't bring himself to speak. John blinked and came fully awake, shifting in his seat to look anxiously at him. Sarah's listed as critical, Jordan said, but she's under the care of a good doctor. They think she'll pull through. Wait, Dieter said. He put the phone against his shoulder and turned to John. He says it looks like your mother should pull through. She's in the care of a good doctor. John let out his breath in something close to a sob, and Dieter put the phone back to his ear. Thank you, he said. There's something else, Jordan said, sounding tired. Yes? There was another backup storage site. In the mountains of Montana, in a secret underbasement, a screen flickered and read, Transmission terminated. No further download possible. On a narrow bed, a young girl with Serena's face lay still, electrodes attached to her temple. Her eyes opened slowly.